Welcome to the Centre for Progressive Change video podcast series. Today, Deirdre and I will be interviewing Dr. Peader Kirby. Peader is a Professor of International Politics and Public Policy in the Department of Politics and Public Administration at the University of Limerick. And today's interview will be based roughly around a chapter in Peader's book, Celtic Tiger in Collapse, which is the chapter entitled Options, and is the final chapter of the book. And as with the previous podcast, we will be breaking the interview up into three segments, past, present and future. And beginning with the past, I would like to ask Peader, what factors do you consider, and events you consider from the past has led us to the crisis that we currently find ourselves in?
Factors or events?
We'll start off with factors.
Well, to me, central to the crisis we're in is a sort of a 50-year-long trajectory of the Irish state more and more deferring to global market forces, so that we got to the stage at the height of the Celtic Tiger boom that whatever multinational companies said to us, whatever major banks said to us in the sense of the representatives of the Irish people, the Irish state, that the Irish state did. I mean, whatever its citizens said to it was far less ready to do, and we had scandal after scandal after scandal of people, vulnerable people in our society who had to take the state to court to get the most minimal rights and the most minimal attendance. But if the multinational companies whispered anything in anybody's ear, they immediately got the state to bend over backwards. I suppose the biggest sign of it all is the fact that, I suppose, the greatest taboo in the Irish state now in terms of an untouchable subject is our 12.5% corporation tax rate, at a time where ordinary people are having huge amounts of, not so much taxation, but of cutbacks in public services, essential public services, and additional taxes almost certainly in the forthcoming budget. The fact that a very low tax rate on some of the most profitable global corporations is considered to be beyond the realm of even discussion is to me an example of just how subservient the Irish state has come in an instinctive way to the needs of global market forces.
And this feeds into what you were discussing in your chapter, and I believe at greater length in your book as well, the Irish model, which I know in the last chapter you broke up into different segments. I think that was a very interesting concept, but you care to elaborate on what the Irish model means?
Yeah, by the Irish model I mean that every country has a particular political economy model. I mean, we think of the bigger models, I suppose, as being the communist model or the social democratic model, but I mean, really, every country is quite distinctive, and it depends on its history, its political culture, the nature of its economy, the mobilization of social forces, etc. But at the end of the day, what particular way in which the state, the market and society interrelate, and a lot of the outcomes in terms of the quality of life of ordinary citizens depends upon that interrelationship. So the Irish model, and that term began to be used during the Celtic Tiger phase, seemed to be, to many people overseas, a particularly successful model, and most countries around the world were finding it very difficult in the era of globalization to achieve very much economic growth at all. Ireland seemed to be one of the exceptions. Together with countries like China and India, Ireland seemed to be bucking the trend and be able to show high rates of economic growth. And so overseas, people began to say, well, what is it that the Irish state is doing that allows it to manage to achieve these high levels of growth? So what from a distance looked to be a very positive way in which the state was acting, we now realise had built in enormous weaknesses. Because as long as you had, and we had of course during what we call the neoliberal era of capitalism, very high levels of finance-driven growth, speculatively driven by finance. And it's interesting that it's those small states that bought into that model, and I'm thinking of Iceland, I'm thinking of the Baltic states, I'm thinking of Hungary, that have come a real cropper with the crisis that financial model has entered into internationally. But it's those states that bought into it. So that's what I mean by model, that You know, that states structure their whole state system and their relationship to the market in such a way that they became overly dependent upon speculative financial capitalism.
And those weaknesses you mentioned there with this model, I noticed that you picked up on a difference of opinion, perhaps on different sides of the spectrum, about where those weaknesses were, whether it was a structural weakness in the Irish model, whether it was particularly sector-based, whether it was the construction industry or the banking industry that brought down what was fundamentally a good model. Would you like to discuss what those differences of opinions were?
Well, this is why I think identifying the model is very important, because the tendency has been to say, well, it was bad developers and it was greedy politicians or greedy bankers that were responsible for this. As you say, that it was a problem that was limited to particular sectors. To me, the model in itself is the cause of this problem. And you can identify the particular dimensions of it. Number one is that its economic growth depended upon very high levels of foreign investment. That foreign investment was seen to rest upon this uniquely low tax rate. And we generalized that from a particular level of taxation, a low level on corporate profits, to become a low tax system. And we sort of prided ourselves that this low tax system was the secret of our success. Of course, the knock-on effect of that was then that we undermined both the capacity of the Irish state and indeed levels of social investment, so that for our level of development or of wealth, we really were an outlier in terms of low levels of social investment, creaking infrastructure, very poor infrastructure, public infrastructure for our levels of development. And that's what I mean by a model, that you can't divorce one from the other. And the collapse that we have seen, the failure of the Irish state to be able to implement a stimulus package, which virtually every other country in the world used as its main way of addressing the crisis, was because we didn't have any extra resources. We cut everything to the bone with this low tax model, and the low tax model is itself derived from our dependence upon high levels of foreign investment. So that's the model. It comes as a package. And that's the model that has now collapsed. We're not going to get back to it. And what we have to do is refound the Irish state, it seems to me. We have to rebuild the Irish nation. We have to refound the whole economy. Because what has collapsed is a model that dates back ultimately to the end of the 1950s, the liberalisation of the Irish economy, and which has deepened until it got to this uniquely vulnerable state during the Celtic Tiger boom. And then the depth of the Irish collapse, which, as we now know, is of course unique in the world. The IMF has called it the worst collapse of any country, anywhere in the world, outside wartime, since the Second World War. It's that serious.
And I think that moves us quite nicely into the present, and the question that Honorees and Catherine were looking for me to ask here, I think is a good one. It's how do you feel Ireland is dealing with the crisis that we have now? Do you think it has been a good response, a bad response, and particularly in terms of leadership? Do you think we've been getting the leadership that we need?
Well, it's a predictable response, let's say. I mean, inevitably what you get is a ruling class, both economic elites and political elites, who respond in the only way they know how. And what they've done is try to, as vigorously as possible, get back to where we were before, and the only mechanism is to impose austerity on ordinary Irish people, not on the elites themselves, who have got off very, very loudly. Now that's a first phase of response. It shows absolutely no vision of the really extensive nature of the crisis. It doesn't address anything of the weaknesses that I've identified about which is at the heart of the Irish model and the collapse that we have seen. It's deepening the crisis. I mean, that's the problem. It's because it's imposing austerity at a time where we desperately need to return to some even modest economic growth to begin to generate the resources to be able to get ourselves out of the most appalling mess we're in. We're doing the opposite. We're deepening the recession. A level of response, however, which I'm rather heartened by. And it seems to me that what it has stimulated is the most interesting and fundamental rethinking of where we're at, which really is happening all over the place. I mean, one sees books coming out, one sees television programs, one hears radio discussions, then you have this wonderful initiative Claiming the Future, which began a whole grassroots discussion up and down the country, brought together sectors that previously have been rather divorced from each other, the community and voluntary sector, the environmental pillar of social partnership, TASC, the trade union movement. All of this is building a robust civil society, which has been extremely weak up to now. Any society is dependent upon the strength and the mobilisatory capacity and, you know, the pluralism of a civil society. By pluralism, I mean the different currents of thought that really do engage in one another in some robust and challenging way. We lacked all of that during this awful boom of the Celtic Tiger. Now we're beginning to recreate, rather painfully, a really vibrant civil society. We're beginning to, I say. We're a long, long way from it. But
the first steps.
We're taking the first steps. And the first steps, I'm delighted to see, are beginning to address issues of values. That's crucial.
And moving into the